The wind on the high plains was a constant, mournful thing. It wasn't a gentle breeze that rustled leaves. It was a force, carving the land, whipping grit into exposed faces, and finding every crack and crevice in a man's defenses, both physical and emotional. Elias Calloway had lived under that wind for 14 years, ever since he'd carved his life out of the unforgiving land in the Wyoming Territory. He'd built his ranch piece by piece, log by log, fence post by fence post. He'd built it with Mary, his wife, a woman who had been sunshine and laughter in a world of endless, dusty sky. Then the fever took Mary 2 winters past, swift and brutal, leaving Elias with a silence so vast it swallowed the wind itself. He was left with the land, the cattle, and a cabin that felt cavernous and cold, the absence of her presence a physical ache in his chest. They had dreamed of children, of small hands helping with chores, of laughter echoing through the cabin. Mary had tried, had prayed, but no child had ever come. They had accepted it, found solace in each other, and the life they built. But after she was gone, the empty spaces in the cabin, in the corral, in his future, screamed with a loneliness Elias had never known possible. He became a silhouette against the endless horizon, defined by his solitude and the quiet grind of survival. He spoke little, saw fewer still. The land demanded his attention. Fence lines needed mending, cattle needed tending, storms blew in without warning. He worked until his muscles ached and his mind was too weary to dwell on memory, but the silence always returned with the dawn. His nearest neighbor, a sour man named Brody who saw shadows and threats in every stranger, kept a wary distance, reinforced by Elias's own standoffish grief. The town, Fort Laramie, was a day's ride away, a collection of muddy streets, transient faces, and hardened souls. Elias went only when necessary, trading hides and beef for supplies, enduring the brief, awkward exchanges with men who either pitied his solitude or left him to it. Respecting the unspoken boundary around his grief, life had narrowed to a brutal, simple cycle: work, endure, mourn, repeat. He was a man existing, not living, tethered to a past that was gone, and a future he saw no point in building. The stasis was a slow, quiet death, settling over him like the dust that coated everything. The catalyst arrived not with a storm or a shout, but in the dusty haze of a late summer afternoon, delivered by a man Elias had never seen before, a lean, shiftless sort with eyes that darted like a cornered rat's. Elias was mending a section of fence near the edge of his property when he saw the wagon approaching, raising a plume of dust against the setting sun. His hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against a post. Strangers were rare and often trouble. The wagon stopped. The man called out a greeting Elias barely heard over the wind. When the man gestured, Elias saw her. She sat in the back of the wagon, huddled against a stack of crates, her face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. She was a native woman, her buckskin dress simple, worn, her braid thick and dark against her back. She didn't look up. "Calloway?" the man asked, his voice thin. Elias nodded, his grip tight on the rifle. "Who's asking?" "Lem Jenkins. Got something here needs deliverin'." Jenkins grinned, a flash of yellowed teeth. "Heard you was lookin' for help, maybe a wife? Someone to keep a house?" Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Help, maybe. He certainly needed it. The ranch was too much for one man, but a wife? The word felt like a desecration of Mary's memory. "Don't know where you heard that, Jenkins. Don't need a wife." No, not exactly a wife," Jenkins corrected, his grin widening. He hitched a thumb towards the woman. "This one, name's Nahili, Cheyenne. Good worker, strong." He leaned closer, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Healthy. But," he paused for effect, glancing at the woman. "Can't. Well, can't give no babies. Tribe got no use for a barren woman these days, too many mouths. Figured someone out here, needin' a hand, maybe someone lonely." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. "Heard you lost your woman, maybe you could use her. For, work, company." Elias stared at the woman. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Barren. The word echoed in the emptiness inside him. He thought of Mary, of the silent grief they had shared over their lack of children. It was a twisted, cruel echo. He looked at Jenkins, at the calculating look in his eyes, then back at the woman, who seemed to shrink into herself. She was a person, not a thing, yet this man spoke of her like livestock. It repulsed him, yet a strange thought took root. Jenkins said she was strong, a good worker. He did need help. And the idea of a woman's presence in the cabin, any woman, to break the suffocating silence. It felt like a betrayal, but also a desperate, ugly kind of hope. "How much?" Elias asked, his voice rough. He hated himself for asking, for even considering it, but the words were out before he could stop them. Jenkins named a price. It was high, extortionate, but not impossible. Elias had saved coin, knowing winters could be hard. He looked at the woman again. Was she being forced, sold like a mare? Jenkins' story about her tribe felt convenient. But she offered no resistance, no plea. Her stillness was absolute. He saw only weariness and resignation in the small curve of her shoulders. After a long, agonizing moment that felt like a lifetime under the relentless sun, Elias nodded slowly. "All right, get her down." Jenkins's grin became triumphant. He hopped down and roughly pulled the woman from the wagon. She stumbled slightly, then stood straight, finally lifting her head. Her eyes, dark and deep, met Elias's. There was no pleading, no fear, only a profound ancient sadness that mirrored his own. She didn't look barren. She looked like a survivor. He paid Jenkins, the transaction feeling dirty in his hands. Jenkins counted the money quickly, gave a perfunctory nod to Elias, and without a word to the woman he had just sold, climbed back into his wagon and drove away, disappearing back into the dust from which he came. Elias and the woman stood in the silence, the only sound the wind whistling past. He looked at her, she looked past him, towards the distant peaks turning purple in the twilight. The moment was heavy with unspoken burdens. She was a stranger, brought into his lonely world not to fill the void left by Mary, but perhaps, he hoped, to make the burden of the ranch less crushing. But already, he felt the weight of her presence, and the unsettling knowledge of how she had come to be here. The stasis of his grief had been shattered, replaced by a new, sharp uncertainty. Their first interactions were defined by this unease and the vast chasm of silence that separated them. Elias showed her to the small lean-to attached to the back of the cabin, originally built for storing firewood and tools, now hastily cleared and given a pallet of straw covered with a couple of blankets. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. He offered her a tin plate of the stew he'd made the night before, leftovers warmed over the fire. She took it with a silent nod, her eyes not meeting his. You can stay here," he said, the words awkward and clumsy on his tongue. "There's water from the well, and the outhouse." He gestured vaguely. I need help, with the ranch, the cattle, the chores, that's why you're here." He felt a desperate need to define the arrangement, to make it purely transactional, even though the circumstances screamed otherwise. She listened, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she simply nodded again, a small, almost imperceptible movement. She ate the stew slowly, methodically, not looking up. Elias watched her for a moment, the silence stretching taut between them, then turned and retreated back into the cabin, leaving the door open. Days turned into a week, then 2. Their communication remained minimal, functional. Elias would leave lists of chores, mending fences, hauling water, helping with the cattle, chopping wood. He spoke in short, clipped sentences. "Water the garden. Fix that post. Cattle need moving." Nahili responded with quiet competence, her movements efficient and strong. She worked tirelessly, without complaint, tackling tasks he'd neglected for months. She seemed to understand the land, the animals, with an instinct he lacked. She moved with a quiet grace that was at odds with the hard labor she performed. They ate their meals separately at first, Elias at his table inside the cabin, Nahili outside the lean-to, or sometimes by the corral while she worked. The silence during these times was thick, heavy with unspoken histories and the awkwardness of their forced proximity. Elias found himself watching her when she didn't know. He noticed the way she knelt to examine the soil, how she seemed to communicate with the skittish horses with just a quiet word or a gentle hand. He saw the strength in her arms as she swung an axe, the focus in her eyes as she repaired a bridle. He had expected resentment, perhaps defiance. He found only quiet capability and an unnerving stillness. One evening, a sudden storm blew in, fierce and unexpected. Wind howled around the cabin like a thing grieving, tearing at the shutters, threatening to rip the roof off. Rain hammered against the glass, driven sideways by the gale. Elias was inside, securing things, when he heard a frantic scratching at the back door. It was Nahili. She was soaked, her clothes plastered to her skin, her hair streaming water. Her eyes, usually so calm, were wide with something that looked like alarm. "Cabin," she said, her voice low, urgent, pointing towards the lean-to. Water was pouring in through gaps in the logs, soaking the straw and her few belongings. The storm was too fierce to stay there. Elias didn't hesitate. He pulled her inside, grabbing towels from a shelf. "Get dry," he commanded, his voice gruff, but laced with an unexpected urgency he hadn't felt in a long time, the urgency of protecting someone. He threw more wood on the fire, the flames leaping to life, pushing back the sudden chill that had entered the cabin with the storm and with her. She dried her hair and face, her movements still reserved. She didn't speak, just watched him as he stoked the fire. The cabin felt smaller, suddenly, with her presence filling a space that had been empty for so long. The air crackled, not just with the storm outside, but with the unspoken tension between them. For the first time, they were sharing the same enclosed space for an extended period, not separated by walls or distance. He offered her a blanket and gestured towards a spot near the fire. She took the blanket, wrapped it around herself, and sat on the floor, her back against the wall, still watchful. He sat at the table, pretending to read a worn newspaper, but his eyes kept drifting towards her. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the curve of her lips. She looked younger, more vulnerable than she did when she was working outside, the quiet competence replaced by a weariness that settled deep in her bones. You don't have to be afraid," he said finally, breaking the long silence. He felt foolish the moment the words left his mouth. Of course, she was afraid. She had been sold, taken from her home, brought to live with a strange, silent man on the edge of nowhere. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his across the flickering firelight. "Not afraid," she said, her voice soft, hesitant, the first time he had heard her speak more than a single word. Her English was quiet, careful, tired. Tired. He understood that. He was tired too. Tired of the silence, tired of the grief, tired of the endless, grinding work that felt like it had no purpose anymore. "Me too," he admitted, the words surprising even himself. Another silence fell, but this one was different. It felt less empty, more like a shared space, a mutual acknowledgement of the burdens they carried. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin by the fire, a fragile truce had begun. Over the next few weeks, the truce deepened into something tentative, uncertain. Elias found himself talking to her more, explaining chores, asking simple questions about her day. She, in turn, began to offer small observations. "Sky looks angry," she might say, pointing to the horizon, a warning he learned to heed. Or, "Grass needs rain." She didn't pry into his past, and he didn't pry into hers, but they learned about each other through their actions and brief, quiet exchanges. He learned she was incredibly skilled with plants, knowing which were edible, which had medicinal properties. She showed him how to mend torn canvas with stitches so fine they were almost invisible. He saw that her barrenness was not a source of shame for her, but a simple fact, stated without emotion when he finally, haltingly, asked about Jenkins' words. She simply nodded. "The spirits did not give me children." There was no self-pity, only acceptance. It humbled him, her quiet dignity in the face of the crude transaction that had brought her here. He, in turn, found himself sharing small details about the ranch, the quirks of his cattle, the history of the cabin. He even, one evening by the fire, spoke Mary's name, the first time he had uttered it aloud in front of another person since the funeral. "My wife?" he said, his voice thick with unshed grief. "Mary. She loved this place. Wanted gardens." Nahili didn't say anything, just nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. She didn't try to fill the space Mary had left, but her presence began to make the space feel less like a wound and more like a place where life still happened. One morning, Elias found her near the corral, gently tending to a young calf that had tangled itself in some wire. It was spooked and crying out, but Nahili's hands were calm, her voice a low, soothing murmur in her own language. She worked patiently, her focus absolute, until the calf was free, trembling but unharmed. Elias watched, unseen, a warmth spreading through his chest he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just competence, it was a deep, innate kindness that radiated from her. She saw the vulnerable and tended to it. He stepped out then, making his presence known. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "Calf was caught," she said simply. "I saw," he replied, his voice softer than usual. You have a way with them." She gave a small, shy smile, the first genuine smile he had seen. It transformed her face, chasing away some of the deep sadness. "They know when you mean no harm," she said. It was a simple statement, but it resonated deeply with Elias. Did he mean no harm to her? He hadn't initially, not intentionally, but he had certainly treated her like a possession, a means to an end. He hadn't meant her harm, but he hadn't offered kindness either. He had offered shelter and work, a bare minimum of human decency dictated by obligation, not compassion. Seeing her gentle kindness to the calf, he felt a pang of shame for his own gruffness, his emotional distance. The barrier between them, built of grief, silence, and the circumstances of their meeting, began to crumble, not with dramatic gestures, but with small, quiet moments. Sharing the warmth of the fire during a storm, a shared smile over a freed calf, unspoken empathy for tired muscles and lonely hearts. They were two wounded souls finding a quiet refuge in each other's unexpected presence. They weren't filling voids, they were creating something new in the empty spaces. Their fragile peace was shattered with the arrival of the surveyor. He came riding up the valley one brisk autumn day, a brisk, officious man named Davison, accompanied by two rough-looking hands. They rode onto Elias's land without greeting, without permission. Elias met them near the barn, rifle in hand, a stance he hadn't needed to take since the early days of settling the land. "You're on my land," he stated, his voice low and dangerous. Davison dismounted, looking Elias up and down with an air of arrogant dismissal. "Mr. Calloway, I presume?" "I am Mr. Davison, representing the Laramie Land Development Company. We are surveying this valley for future settlement." "This valley is settled by me," Elias said, gripping the rifle tighter. Yes, we have your claim on file," Davison said, waving a dismissive hand. "But there are technicalities. Boundaries are often fluid on the frontier, you understand, and reports reach town of who you are keeping here." He glanced towards the cabin, where Nahili stood in the doorway, watching, her expression tense. Elias felt a cold fury wash over him. The rumors, Brody, no doubt, spreading his poison. "Who I keep on my land is my business." "Normally, yes," Davison agreed smoothly, though his eyes were hard. "But certain arrangements are frowned upon. Particularly with the influx of new settlers. People want order. They want familiar faces, not—" He gestured towards Nahili, the contempt plain on his face. "Not wildness." "She is not wild. She is in my employ," Elias said, though the word felt weak, inadequate, a flimsy shield against the prejudice radiating from Davison. "Employ?" Davison chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Come now, Calloway, we know the stories, a squaw, found, or acquired, shall we say. And unable to bear children, isn't that the talk?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping slightly, ostensibly confidential, but loud enough for his men and for Nahili to hear. "People talk, Calloway. They say you keep her locked away. Say she's stolen. Say you bought her." The word hung in the air, ugly and heavy. Elias flinched inwardly, the shame of that day washing over him anew. But looking at Nahili, standing straight despite the implied accusations and open contempt, seeing the quiet strength in her posture, the shame curdled into a fierce, protective anger. "She is under my protection," Elias said, his voice steel. "And this land is mine. You have no right to survey it. Get off my property." Davison's smile vanished, his face hardened. "You will reconsider, Calloway. The company is prepared to make a generous offer for this prime location. Cooperation is advised. Interfering with our survey will have consequences." "I won't be selling," Elias said, raising the rifle slightly. "And you are interfering with my peace. This is your last warning." Davison stared at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowed. He saw the resolve in Elias's stance, the cold fury in his eyes. He saw the rifle pointed steadily in their direction. He was a man of paper and negotiation, not bullets. With a final, disgusted look towards Nahili, he turned and remounted his horse. "This isn't over, Calloway," he snarled. "We'll be back, and next time, we won't be alone." He spurred his horse, and he and his men rode away, the dust they kicked up a final angry gesture. Elias stood there for a long time, watching them go, the rifle still steady in his hands. The peaceful quiet of the ranch had been shattered. They were threatened, not just by a land company, but by the ugliness of prejudice and the long arm of so-called civilization reaching out to claim everything it deemed valuable, including people. He turned back to the cabin. Nahili was still standing in the doorway, her face impassive, but her eyes held a depth of understanding. She had heard it all. The accusations, the insults, the chilling nonchalance with which Davison had spoken of her, as if she were property to be disputed. He walked towards her, the weight of what was to come settling heavily on his shoulders. "They'll be back," he said, stating the obvious truth. "I know," she replied quietly. "They want the land, they want me gone." "They won't get either," Elias said, his voice firm. It wasn't just about the land anymore, it was about her. About the fragile, unexpected connection that had grown between them in the lonely quiet of the plains. He had bought her out of a complex mix of desperation and misguided need, but he would protect her out of something far simpler and far more powerful. That night, the silence in the cabin was different again. It wasn't the emptiness of grief, nor the awkwardness of strangers, nor the shared truce. It was the charged quiet of two people who knew they were facing a threat together. Elias sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. Nahili sat across from him, weaving a small basket from dried grasses, her fingers moving with practiced ease. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of the grass as she worked. "My people. When someone is cast out, they are often alone," Nahili said, her voice barely above a whisper, breaking the long silence. "The land is hard. People are harder." "Not everyone," Elias said, looking at her. She met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw not just the sadness from before, but a flicker of something else, recognition perhaps, or a nascent trust. "No," she agreed softly. "Not everyone." The threat of Davison and his company hung over them through the late autumn and into the early winter. Elias strengthened the defenses of the ranch, hauling more logs, reinforcing fences, practicing with his rifle. Nahili worked alongside him, silently, efficiently. She seemed to anticipate his needs, handing him tools before he asked, pointing out weaknesses in the perimeter he hadn't noticed. They were a unit, bound by the shared threat and the life they were quietly building. Word reached them through a sympathetic soul in town, a man who admired Elias's stubbornness against the company men, that Davison was gathering support, spreading lies about Elias, portraying him as a lawless renegade keeping an Indian captive. The prejudice of some townsfolk, already simmering, began to boil. Brody, in particular, was vocal in his condemnation. "That squall bring trouble," he'd warned the few people who would listen. "They ain't meant for settled life. She probably killed her own kind to get here, and Calloway, keeping her, it ain't natural." The conflict was coming, not just for the land, but for their right to simply exist together. It came one cold, clear morning just before the first snow was expected. Elias was in the barn mending tack, and Nahili was down by the stream, checking the water supply. He heard the pounding of hooves first, more than one rider, then shouts. He grabbed his rifle and ran out of the barn. 5 men rode towards the cabin, led by Davison, flanked by his 2 hands from before, and 2 other men Elias recognized from town, Brody and another unpleasant sort named Hicks. They were armed, their faces set with determination and malice. "Calloway," Davison shouted, pulling his horse to a halt 50 yards from the cabin. "We're here to settle this." Elias raised his rifle, sighting it on Davison. "Get off my land. I won't tell you again." "We ain't here for the land today, Calloway," Brody yelled, his face red with exertion and anger. "We're here for the woman. The law's on our side. Keeping a savage like that is against God and man." "There is no law out here but what I make," Elias retorted, his voice echoing across the valley. He saw Nahili emerge from the trees near the stream, alerted by the shouting. She didn't run, didn't hide. She walked towards the cabin, towards him, her head held high. "She ain't got no right to be here," Hicks shouted. "She's bad luck, probably stole something. Give her over, Calloway, or we'll take her by force." Elias lowered his rifle slightly, but kept it aimed. "She is free to be here. She is not a captive. She is under my protection." He looked at Brody. "She works hard. She is a better neighbor than you've ever been." Brody spurred his horse forward a few paces, his face contorted with rage. "You gone soft, Calloway, keeping a Barren squaw. We heard about her. Useless. You're a fool. Give her up." The word Barren, used as an insult, a condemnation, struck Elias with a fresh wave of fury. It wasn't a mark of shame, it was a simple fact of her life, twisted by their malice. He looked at Nahili, who had reached his side now, standing shoulder to shoulder with him, her presence a quiet, powerful anchor. "She is not useless," Elias said, his voice ringing with conviction. He looked at Davison, then at the men from town. "She saved that calf when it was tangled. She knows the land better than any of you. She has brought more life to this place than all of you ever could." He paused, taking a breath, the words coming from a place deep within him he hadn't known existed. "She is not barren. Not here. She has brought purpose to a life that was empty. She has brought a quiet kindness that this harsh land desperately needs. And she has brought me something better than a baby could ever be." He meant it. He looked at Nahili, standing beside him, strong and resolute. He hadn't found a replacement for Mary or the children they couldn't have. He had found something else entirely, a partner, a companion, a bond forged in shared solitude and mutual respect. A quiet, steady love that had nothing to do with bloodlines or societal expectations. "What are you talking about, Calloway? You're out of your mind," Davison exclaimed, taken aback by Elias's unexpected declaration. "I'm talking about my life," Elias said, his gaze sweeping over the men. "And you have no place in it. Get out, now." He raised the rifle again, making it clear his patience had run out. Brody snarled and started to level his own rifle. Before Elias could react, Nahili stepped slightly forward, raising her hand. She spoke, not in English, but in her own language. A clear, strong torrent of words directed at the men. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority. Elias didn't understand the words, but he understood the intent. It was a defiance, a challenge, a claim. She was standing her ground, claiming her place. The men hesitated, visibly unnerved by her unexpected voice, her presence not as a cowering captive, but as a formidable woman standing beside her man. Davison exchanged a look with Brody. They had expected a lonely, broken widower, easily intimidated. They had found a man transformed, defended by a woman they had dismissed as worthless. "This ain't worth the trouble today," Davison muttered, pulling back. "We'll find another way." Brody looked like he wanted to push it, but Davison's men were already turning their horses. Brody and Hicks glared at Elias and Nahili, their faces promising future conflict, but they followed, riding away back the way they came. Elias lowered his rifle slowly. The immediate threat was gone, but the air still crackled with tension. He turned to Nahili. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She smiled, the same small, shy smile from the day she tended the calf. "I told them this land is protected, that I walk with the man who honors it, and that they bring only ugliness, and ugliness is weak." He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not the woman who was sold, not the woman unable to bear children, but Nahili, strong, kind, wise, his partner, his companion. The one who had quietly rebuilt his world piece by piece, not with grand gestures, but with shared silences, mutual work, and a profound, unspoken understanding. The void in his life hadn't been filled, it had been transformed, blooming with a connection he hadn't sought but now cherished more than anything. "You weren't barren," he said. The words a realization as much as a statement. "You just hadn't found the right ground." She reached out and gently touched his arm, her eyes soft. "And you," she said quietly, "you were like the land in winter, frozen, but the spring finds its way eventually." Life on the ranch didn't magically become easy after that day. The prejudice of some neighbors remained, a low hum of discontent. Davison and his company never returned directly, but the threat of encroaching settlement was ever present. Yet, everything was different. Elias and Nahili continued their lives together, side by side. They worked the ranch, facing the harshness of the land, the capriciousness of the weather, the endless demands of survival. But they faced it together. Their cabin, once a tomb of grief, became a home, filled not with the laughter of children they didn't have, but with the quiet rhythm of two lives intertwined. The scent of Nahili's cooking filled the air, chasing away the lingering smell of dust and sorrow. Her quiet singing in her own language drifted through the open windows on warm evenings. Elias found himself smiling more, talking more, his gaze no longer fixed solely on the past, but looking towards the future they were building, day by quiet day. They never spoke of the transaction again, not directly. It was a ghost that haunted the edges of their past, a reminder of the cruelty of the world and the improbable circumstances that had brought them together. But it no longer defined them. They had chosen each other, not out of obligation or despair, but out of a mutual recognition of resilience, kindness, and a shared need for belonging. Nahili didn't bear children, and the ache of that old familiar grief for Elias never entirely vanished, a faint scar on his heart. But in Nahili, he had found a connection that ran deeper than blood, a partnership built on the bedrock of respect and quiet love. She had brought life back to him, purpose back to the ranch, and warmth back to the cold corners of his soul. She had been brought to him for one thing, but in the end, she had given him something else entirely, something he hadn't known he needed, something infinitely more precious. She had given him a future. She had given him home, and in that home, two lonely souls had found a love that was, in its own quiet way, a miracle on the high plains. The wind still blew, but now, it sounded less like a mourning and more like a song,